But I also want to call to your attention tonight that we are in the midst of a 3-year project funded by the A.W. Mellon Foundation. And it's a project on reparations and the African-American experience. And we have a team of people who are working on that project. And I want to recognize some of the people who are involved. One segment of the team is what we're calling the writing fellows. We've been involved in writing a new history of African Americans in Pittsburgh. And I want to acknowledge Larry Glasgow, Rob Ruck, and Tony Norman. Those are people who have been involved in helping us to research and write the history, a new history we'll call it, of African Americans in Pittsburgh. But also we're fortunate to have 2 community fellows, and one of those fellows is here, and his name is Carla Young, Mr. Wade. I really appreciate Carla and Patricia Mitchell, who is not in the room, but perhaps on Zoom. I want to thank them for their work. They have been stellar promoters and coordinators of many events connected with this project, particularly the oral history. Our graduate research assistants have been critical to this effort. And I want to acknowledge Stacy O'Kines, who is here tonight. Okay. The Arco, Dr. is here tonight. And Michael White, who is probably on Zoom. So I want to thank you, RAs, research assistants, for all that you've done for the project and all that you are doing. We have something called the Community Advisory Committee that is comprised of several people. Esther Bush, Charlene Foley Barnett, Ralph Proctor, and Sam Black are the members of that committee. But the co-chairs of that committee are 2 gentlemen, Ben Houston, who is actually at the university, and he is in the UK, and also Waverly Duck, who is now at the University of California in Santa Barbara. I want to thank them for the work that they are doing, connecting us with the larger community. Finally, it's been a while since we've met, but I want to thank our advisory board, the Cause Advisory Board. I want to thank the board for their patience over the last couple of years. We will be holding meetings soon and bringing the board up to speed on what we are now. And those board members include Eric Anderson, our department chair, Nico Slade, Etta Fields Black, and Catherine Barber, who is a librarian working on cataloging our oral history project. So I want to thank those board members. Finally, the most important gratitude goes to you, the audience. I want to say thank you for being stellar supporters of Cause over the years. And although the COVID-19 interrupted our face-to-face meetings, I've been appreciative that you have joined us online and have kept our programs alive. So thank you. We appreciate that. And so finally, without further ado, I want to turn to the introduction of our speaker, Dr. R. G. Smith. It is indeed an honor and a pleasure to introduce Professor Smith. Dr. Smith is an exceedingly productive scholar, minister, and professor of urban ministry at the Metro Urban Institute at the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He earned 3 higher education degrees from Yale University, one a Master of Divinity, another Master of Arts, and then finally the PhD in political science. In addition to service, he has service as director of the Metro Urban Institute Dr. Smith is a research professor at the Institute of Gender Studies at the University of South Africa. Drew is a tireless researcher and collaborator across national boundaries. He is a founding co-convener of the Transatlantic Roundtable on Religion and Race. This roundtable is a dynamic network of scholars, activists, and community leaders working at the intersections of religion and various markers of social difference. Dr. Smith has been busy. He has conducted numerous research projects on religion and public life in the United States, South Africa, and East Africa. His transnational work includes service as a Fulbright professor at the University of Pretoria and a Fulbright senior specialist position at the Presbyterian Theological Seminary in Cameroon. He has published widely on religion and public life. His publications include some 10 edited or co-edited books and over 80 articles, chapters, essays, and reports. He is the author of the foundational book, From Every Mountainside, Black Churches and the Terrain of Civil Rights. And then more recently, he is the author of Racialized Health, COVID-19 Religious Responses. He has recently completed writing a book on contemporary Black clergy activism, which is forthcoming with Columbia University Press. So we are fortunate to have with us such a prolific and creative scholar of the African American experience. And without further ado, I will bring him to the podium to deliver a talk titled Situating Faith Communities and the Struggle for Reparation. Let us welcome Professor Drew Smith.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Dr. Trotter, dear colleague, brilliant scholar, prolific scholar, someone who has really established the frameworks to such a great extent of the study and the understanding of Black urban economies, Black urban economics, and urban economics more broadly. I've been privileged to be able to get to know Dr. Trotter over the last decade, to interact with him on several occasions, including several occasions when he came to Pittsburgh Theological Seminary as part of our work with the Metro Urban Institute. And Dr. Trotter brought his wisdom and scholarship to those occasions in ways that significantly impacted our work. And he's just been supportive and just a great scholar, great friend to all of you. The great work of the Center for African American Urban Studies and the Economy, including this initiative that you've invited me to join you on today, a very important initiative related to reparations and how to begin to fill in some of the details of what that might look like in particular local context and Pittsburgh especially. So Dr. Trotter, thanks again for the invitation. I'm glad to be here. You invited me to talk a bit about the Black faith community's involvement around reparations, something that is not necessarily a ready association between Black churches and the reparations discussion. Some people you ask may feel that there's not necessarily been an extensive footprint by Black churches related to reparations, but I'd like to speak to that today in some ways that might shift that perspective a bit. Clearly, there has been significant work done by Black churches related, and the Black faith community more broadly, related to the issue of reparations. I'm going to lay out some historical aspects of this and then move briefly at the end of my discussion to some reflection on current involvements by the Black faith community in Pittsburgh around reparations. And we can explore aspects of this further in the discussion time that's left for us. I'm assuming about 40 minutes for the, and then discussion.
Yeah.
We'll see how close we come to all that.
Okay,
Okay,
take your time.
all right. Since the mid 1800s, a vanguard of African-American religious leaders has emphasized the economic underpinnings of Black oppression and persistent racial inequities. Abolitionist and AME Zion lay minister Frederick Douglass spoke in 1856, for example, of, quote, the dreaded effects of accumulated wealth in the hands of a few, creating an aristocracy of wealth ready to be the tool of an aggressive tyranny, close quote. Douglass forcefully condemned a, quote, unlimited hoarding of wealth and monopolies of land, which has converted almost the entire civilized world into an abode of millionaires and beggars, which renders the enslavement of the peoples of the world possible, close quote. Concerns over race-based economic disparities were made equally explicit by early 20th century pastor Adam Clayton Powell Sr., whose son succeeded him as pastor of Harlem's Abyssinian Baptist Church and then represented Harlem in the US Congress. In a 1932 publication titled The Attitude of Jesus Toward World Problems, Powell Sr. criticized, quote, corporations or individuals who amass wealth solely for the sake of comfort and luxury, while neglecting the needs of society, close quote. He called for, quote, a more equal distribution of wealth if we're going to stave off an economic world revolution, close quote. 35 years later, Martin Luther King Jr. outlined another revolution of sorts, indicating poverty could not be adequately addressed, quote, through a little change here and a little change there, but would require instead a reconstruction of the whole society, a revolution of values, and a radical redistribution of power, close quote. King was also numbered among the subset of Black religious leaders who embraced the idea of redistribution in concrete and not simply philosophical terms, assigning financial amounts to Black social injury, disadvantage, and loss caused by racially unjust American systems and structures. So the analysis here examines important instances of Black clergy reparations advocacy, from Bishop Henry McNeil Turner's late 19th century demands for federal payments toward emigrationism and Black Atlantic linkages, to 21st century Black clergy involvements in national level, local level, and sector-specific reparations policy activism. Attention is paid to evolving theoretical and operational framings of this reparations advocacy, including the metrics and mechanisms of redistributive frameworks. Although religious leaders tend to rely strongly on moral and spiritual claims in their pronouncements on human affairs, and have leaned toward those premises throughout much of their reparations advocacy, their involvements in reparations advocacy in recent years reflect a growing emphasis within the reparations movement upon achievability. This turn towards achievability reflects a deeper-seated African-American pragmatism, a praxis defined by early 20th century philosopher Alain Locke in terms of, quote, dethroning our absolutes while taking care not to exile our imperatives, close quote. Similarly, religion scholar Eddie Glaude Jr. points to a well-established Black pragmatism that, quote, seeks to avoid dogmas while focusing instead on the ability or inability to secure desired aims in a somewhat hostile environment, close quote. The emphasis on achievability and increases in public acceptability of reparations may be interrelated, as may be deduced from recent polling data. With respect to acceptability, YouGov data showed Black support for the idea of reparatory cash payments increasing from 59% in 2014 to 86% in 2021, while Black opposition decreased from 19% to 14% during that time frame. The studies showed similar trends in white opinion about cash reparations payments as well, with white support increasing from 6% in 2014 to 28% in 2021, and white opposition decreasing from 79% to 72%. Those studies also show linkages in perceptions of acceptability and achievability of reparations, at least from the perspective of white respondents, who expressed much stronger preferences for non-cash reparatory measures than for cash payments, with 52% supporting a memorial, 47% supporting a memorial on the National Mall, and 39% supporting an official apology. With this increased public support for reparations has come greater governmental sector and civil society sector receptivity toward action. But although this increased responsiveness has been welcomed within reparations advocacy circles, contemporary American progress on reparations has been criticized, including for lack of public support for cash reparations and for other inadequacies of reparatory metrics and frameworks. Black religious leaders' reparations, perspectives, promotions, and initiatives are examined here across various historical periods and strategical frameworks, with attention to content, adaptability to context, and alignments within broader reparations movement advocacy and objectives. The conclusions drawn from available evidence here is that reparations advocacy by Black religious leaders has proven more pragmatic than purist, as concerns have shifted increasingly toward realizability of reparations objectives in ways contributing breadth to the reparations movement. Heeding the call for reparations. Within a late 19th century context where African Americans were positioned to make few demands on American power structure that had brutally enforced Black enslavement and that was subsequently entrenching systemic racial segregation, AME Bishop Henry McNeil Turner promoted 2 steps toward remedying the racial situation. Firstly, considering what he believed to be the unlikelihood of significant Black social justice or empowerment within turn-of-the-century white supremacist America, Turner advocated collective Black repatriation to Africa. Secondly, he insisted the US government should be the financial underwriter of this collective Black relocation. Writing in an AME periodical in 1900, Turner argued Blacks had, quote, worked and enriched the country while continuing to be denied civil and political rights, and should view as sensible the idea of asking for $100 million to go home. Africa is our home, said Turner, and is the one place that offers us manhood and freedom. He stated further, $100 million can be obtained if we as a race would ask for it. The way we figure it out, this country owes us $40 billion, and we are afraid to ask for $100 million, close quote. Simultaneous with Turner's reparations efforts were those of another Black clergyman, Isaiah H. Dickerson, an educator who was general manager of the National Ex-Slave Mutual Relief, Bounty, and Pension Association of the United States of America. The organization, which was chartered August 7th, 1897, and headquartered in Nashville, Tennessee, pursued congressional legislation that would provide pensions to formerly enslaved Blacks along with mutual aid and burial expenses. Historian Miranda Booker Perry outlines the details of the provisions pursued through the organization's legislative advocacy. Quote, the organization supported a proposed pension payment scale based upon the age of beneficiaries that appeared in every ex-slave bill from 1899 onward. Ex-slaves 70 years and older at the time of disbursement were to receive an initial payment of $500 and $15 a month for the rest of their lives. Those aged 60 to 69 years old will receive $300 and $312 a month. Those aged 50 to 59 receive $108 a month, and those under 50 will receive a $4 a month pension. If formerly enslaved persons were either very old or too ill to care for themselves, their caretakers were to be compensated, close quote. In a detailed history of this pensions campaign, historian Mary Frances Berry suggests that what contributed to Dickerson's advocacy was his awareness of how readily available pensions were at the time for Union military veterans. So much so, from Dickerson's viewpoint, that, quote, anyone who's been any place near the Army could get a pension for a lifetime, quote, close quote. Consequently, Dickerson believed pensions most certainly were deserved by the old ex-slaves who worked unpaid all their lives and then helped the Union digging ditches at the forts, washing the soldiers' clothes, cooking for them, and nursing the injured. I'm going to skip on down a little here. Turner's and Dickerson's respective formulations on reparations pushed beyond acceptable strategic boundaries and racial analytics within the American political context of their day, but also located largely outside realms of consideration for many of their Black Christian contemporaries. Black Christian speculation on reparations, at least to the mid-20th century, were more consistent with the views of Reverend Joseph H. Jackson, the formidable president, 1953 to 1982, of the nation's largest Black religious communion, the approximately 6 million member National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated, NBC USA. This was the Baptist body from which Martin Luther King Sr. and Jr. and many socially progressive pastors split in 1961 to form the Progressive National Baptist Convention, largely in reaction to Jackson's resistance to civil rights protest activities and Jackson's reluctance toward transformative social change efforts in general. Regarding reparations, for example, Jackson was defiant about the fact that NBC USA churches, quote, never asked for reparations. They built their own churches with their own hands and their own money, said Jackson. This was a matter of Black economic principle, and quote, we must learn how to organize our capital, harness our earnings, and set them to work for us, Jackson insisted. These comments by Jackson in 1970 came on the heels of two significant expressions of reparations demands during the late 1960s by Black religious leaders. Firstly, in the months prior to King's 1968 assassination, he had begun placing a stronger emphasis on poverty and was organizing a national Poor People's Campaign in response to American economic inequities. The campaign's strategic center was a mass protest gathering plan for the National Mall in Washington, accompanied by an ongoing tent city occupation of the mall, as well as a set of reparations-like demands King referred to as an economic Bill of Rights. Those demands included $30 billion targeted at fighting poverty, guaranteed full employment and income, and the construction of 500,000 affordable homes each year. King understood the campaign to be an existential fight for American structural transformation, stating, quote, we would go to Washington and demand to be heard, and we would stay until America responded. If this meant forcible repression of our movement, we would confront it, for we have done this before. If it meant scorn or ridicule, we embrace it, for that is what America's poor now receive. If it meant jail, we accepted it willingly, for the millions of poor were already imprisoned by exploitation and discrimination, close quote. King had begun laying the foundations for his economic rights and restructuring agenda several years earlier through promotions of what he referred to as the Bill of Rights for the Disadvantaged. Outlining this Bill of Rights in speeches he made at the 1964 Democratic and Republican conventions, and in his 1964 book, Why We Can't Wait. King's proposed Bill of Rights called for governmental expenditures of $50 billion over 10 years on educational, housing, and employment assistance for impoverished Americans earning less than $3,000 annually, irrespective of race, and for families making less than $3,000 annually to receive direct payment to reach $3,000. King justified these measures by highlighting the nation's systemic social and economic oppression of African Americans. Quote, certainly the Negro has been deprived. Few people consider the fact that in addition to being enslaved for 2 centuries, the Negro was during all these years robbed of the wages of his toil. No amount of gold could provide an adequate compensation for the exploitation and humiliation of the Negro in America down through the centuries. The payment should be in the form of a massive program by the government of special compensatory measures, which could be regarded as a settlement in accordance with the accepted practice of common law. Such measures would certainly be less expensive than any computation based on 2 centuries of unpaid wages and accumulated interest. King was assassinated before he could fully implement his hope for mobilization around this economic rights agenda. Although the march the march to Washington for the Poor People's Campaign did take place under the leadership of King's colleagues, Jesse Jackson, his wife, Coretta Scott King, and others, after his death. While King's statement of economic rights could be classified as a somewhat veiled reparations demand, a more explicit call for reparations, the Black Manifesto, was issued in 1969 at a national Black Economic Development Conference in Detroit, facilitated primarily by the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization, IFCO. The manifesto demanded $500 million from the American power structure toward the establishing of the following: a Southern land bank in support of Black farmers, 4 major Black publishing houses, 4 Black television networks, a research skills center for research on Black life, a Black training center for teaching skills needed in communications fields, and structures for community organizing initiatives among welfare recipients. The manifesto, composed in large part by former Student Nonviolent Coordinating Conference executive James Foreman, SNCC, was approved and presented by delegates at the Detroit Conference, including by religious leaders affiliated with IFCO and by some collaborating organizations, the National Committee of Black Churchmen. A few days after the Detroit Conference, Foreman, who served as the BEDC field director, attended the Sunday morning worship services at New York City's historic Riverside Church, where he marched to the front of the sanctuary and interrupted service with a prophetic declaration of the manifesto's demands. This was not well received by those in attendance at the service or by many persons across the country who learned about the incident. But although Foreman was subsequently invited to present the manifesto at a board meeting of the National Council of Churches, the manifesto received very little moral support nationally from white or Black churches, and the only financial resources it secured was a $300,000 contribution in 1969 from the United Methodist Church, predominantly white United Methodist Church. Although support for reparations may have been in short supply within American Christian circles, explicit support for the idea of reparations has been a feature of Black religious nationalist groups, such as the Nation of Islam, since at least the early 1960s. In 1961, the NOI newspaper, Mohammed Speaks, initiated a section called What the Muslims Want and What the Muslims Believe, containing among its principles the following. Quote, we want our people in America whose parents or grandparents were descendants from slaves to be allowed to establish a separate state or territory of their own, either on this continent or elsewhere. We believe that our former slave masters are obligated to provide such land and that the area must be fertile and minerally rich. We believe that our former slave masters are obligated to maintain and supply our needs in this separate territory for the next 20 to 25 years until we are able to produce and supply our own needs, close quote. This principle ran continuously in the publication and subsequently was included in its successor publication, The Final Call. NOI spokesman Malcolm X brought further detail to NOI thinking about reparations in a 1963 speech at Michigan State University. Malcolm stated, quote, the greatest contribution this country was that the greatest contribution to this country was that which was contributed by the Black man. Now, when you see this, and then you stop to consider the wages that were kept back from millions of Black people, not for 1 year, but for 310 years, you'll see how this country got so rich so fast and what made the economy as strong as it is today. And all that slave labor that was amassed in unpaid wages is due someone today, close quote. In addition to statements of the principle of reparations, one branch of the original NOI called the Lost Found Nation of Islam, which was launched in 1977 by longstanding NOI follower Silas Muhammad, collaborated in 1944 with a group called Caucasians United for Reparations and Emancipation, CURE, in petitioning the United Nations for its support of reparations for African Americans. The petition, submitted simultaneously to the World Court in The Hague, was formally accepted and recorded by the UN and forwarded to the offending government, the United States. Nevertheless, it received no further action. Since Louis Farrakhan began in the late 1970s after the death of Elijah Muhammad to reestablish NOI's original mission, he has endeavored to affirm and advance Elijah Muhammad's teachings, including earlier NOI frameworks related to reparations. Farrakhan has been systematic in his itemizations of Black social injuries, tracing to enslavement, and has placed a continuous emphasis on provision of millions of acres of land in the US or elsewhere as payment for the sufferings and injustices visited upon Black people. The separatist and immigrationist aspects of Black religious nationalists, extending back to Bishop Turner, have been readily evident, with Farrakhan updating the nation-building purposes of an independent Black land base to include serving as spaces of reprieve and restoration for hundreds of thousands of incarcerated African Americans. By the late 1980s, Farrakhan was publicly demanding, quote, that the United States and governments in Africa should be pressured to create a fertile, mineral-rich country to which Black prisoners in US jails could immigrate. In the early 2000s, he was making these same demands and directing them at President George W. Bush. Quote, just send Black prisoners to the Nation of Islam and we'll make them better, he said. Let them do their time in Africa, close quote. Farrakhan articulated hopes that Africa could be persuaded to, quote, set aside some territory that's fertile and mineral rich with an outlet to the sea, while indicating that the land should be paid for by the US government through monies otherwise spent incarcerating African Americans and monies owed African Americans for hundreds of years of mistreatment. Farrakhan has also been consistent in extending accountability for African American suffering to include other sectors and other nations. In a 2014 speech in Antigua, Farrakhan stated, there was something in the Catholic Church called the papal bulls, a type of letter issued by the Pope. The Pope issued a papal bull granting Portugal and Spain full and free permission to invade, search out, and capture unbelievers and enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, and reduce their persons into perpetual slavery. So when we are asking for reparations, we can't leave the church out. You can't leave the Pope out, nor can you leave European countries out, said Farrakhan. Farrakhan became a central figure in reparations discussion by the 1990s, as illustrated in part by his invitation from ABC News anchor Sam Donaldson to discuss reparations on a 1990 episode of Donaldson's popular news show, Primetime Live. Although Donaldson's interest seemed to be in refuting Black claims to reparations, Farrakhan was able nonetheless to outline his case for reparations before a national television audience. Farrakhan's profile expanded further after his massive Million Man March in 1995, as did his influence and reach as a reparations spokesman. The 2002 Millions for Reparations demonstration and protest in Washington provided another strategic platform for Farrakhan's reparations advocacy. The two-day event, August 16th and 17th, again in 2002, included among its primary facilitators the National Coalition for Blacks, the National Coalition of Blacks for Reparations in America, in COBRA, and the National Black United Front, the latter founded and chaired by Pentecostal pastor Herbert Daughtry. Farrakhan served as keynote speaker at the event's August 16 gathering at Washington's People's Congregational Church, attended by 1,300 people, and Farrakhan spoke again from the platform at the August 17th rally, attended by thousands of persons on the National Mall. In 2003, Farrakhan hosted dozens of reparations advocates from across the US for a series of strategy sessions he led on operational unity within the reparations movement. As a culmination of that organizing, Farrakhan delivered an address at the 2004 gathering of NOI's Savior's Day Convention, which he titled Reparations, What Does America and Europe Owe? What Does Allah Promise? Farrakhan has continued to be a leading 21st century voice on reparations, though NOI platforms such as the annual Savior's Day Convention, and the Final Call newspaper, through Savior's Day Convention, Final Call newspaper, and via speaking engagements across the US, Caribbean, and Africa. As acknowledgement of Farrakhan's leadership within the reparations movement, in COBRA gave Farrakhan its Lifetime Achievement Award at its 30th annual convention in 2019. Next section, from reparations ideals to operationalization. In COBRA's founding in 1988, as a coalition of multiple organizations and leaders committed to reparations, marked for some the emergence of the modern day reparations movement. With this trajectory representing important divergences at points from reparations advocacy by Black religious leaders. One of the distinctives ushered in by COBRA, and that became a defining feature of the more prominent reparations activism from that point forward, was the progression beyond merely bold demands and expressive defiance to greater reliance on Black leadership cadres capable of leveraging politically strategic, institutional, and intellectual capital on behalf of the reparations cause. For example, the leadership pool on which COBRA drew in its founding and initial activism included prominent scholars such as Howard University political science chair and Jesse Jackson presidential campaign manager Ronald Walters, Columbia University's Institute for Research in African American Studies founding director Manning Marable, Cornell University's Africana Studies Department founding chair James Turner, and renowned poet Sonia Sanchez, Black elected officials such as Michigan State Senator Bill Owens, along with prominent activists such as Black Panther Party co-founder Bobby Seale, and Republic of New Africa co-founder Imari Obadele, who also was the co-founder of COBRA. Across its 35-year history, COBRA has served as one of the largest sources of information and research on reparations and of organizational backing for reparations advocacy on Capitol Hill. That would include support for House Resolution 40, the reparations bill introduced in 1989 by Michigan Congressman John Conyers, and reintroduced every year thereafter until Conyers retired from Congress in 2017, and then subsequently sponsored by Texas Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. This contrast between expressive and instrumental reparations advocacy was evident at the 2002 Millions for Reparations demonstration and protest in Washington, D.C., with presentations by religious leaders such as Farrakhan and Daughtry, tilting more strongly toward an emphasis on Black consciousness raising and social healing. And political officials' presentations, such as Conyers outlining legislative proposals. Farrakhan, for example, while consistent in his calls for land payments to descendants of enslaved Africans, also gave considerable attention to the need for Black cultural and psychic repair. Quote, "We need payment for the destruction of our minds and for the robbery of our language, our culture, our history, our religion, our God, our self-dignity, our self-worth," said Farrakhan. Similarly, although Daughtry stressed the need for a Marshall Plan to rebuild cities and to address racial inequities in educational and healthcare opportunities, he brought especially energetic support to ideas expressed in his conclusion about defining, quote, winning in terms of people's consciousness being raised and by putting the enemy on the defensive with a moral argument, close quote. Conyers' remarks, however, at the rally defined the reparations battle and indicators of reparations progress in terms of immediate public redress, referring to the audience as, quote, leaders of the effort for reparations now, not in the next century. He insisted the achievement of reparations would not occur simply by praying, which he regarded as an important stimulus to action. Instead, said Conyers, we get reparations, quote, now by contacting every single member of the House of Representatives and every single member of the United States Senate in order to influence and educate and motivate them to step up to the plate for our long neglected cause, reparations for every one of the descendants of African Americans whose predecessors were held in bondage, close quote. He also led the audience in a pledge to contact the congressional representatives and respective senators before the end of the month to determine where those elected officials stood on what he referred to as the simple and modest HR 40 proposal to facilitate the first detailed, exhaustive study of reparations that has ever been held in the United States Congress. Congressional support for HR 40 remains slow going, although the bill made it out of committee in the House for the first time in 2021, and currently has more than 200 House co-sponsors. In fact, I think they're only one vote short in the House at this point. Senator Cory Booker, Democrat of New Jersey, introduced a companion bill in 2019 in the US Senate, S 1083, that has faced a far steeper climb than the House bill. Nevertheless, the congressional reparations bills have catalyzed state and local reparations initiatives alongside strong support networks for the federal bills, with key support from denominations and ecumenical groups such as the National Council of Churches, the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, the Episcopal Church, and the United Church of Christ. Commitments to the kind of operationalizable reparations frameworks and targets evidenced by Congress and by other reparations-related legislative activism have been increasingly characteristic of reparations advocacy throughout the first quarter of the 21st century. This aligns with contemporary concerns within the field of public policy with ensuring public policy making that produces measurable and positive results and that is able to define a problem, strategize solutions, anticipate the social response, and consider benefits and costs as defined by scholars in public policy making world. The HR 40 initiative certainly has tried to avoid overreach and to set achievable goals for advancing the reparations cause. So too have several other contemporary reparations initiatives whose advocacy has been targeted at institutional or local municipal contexts. With respect to institutional targets, there are recent and widely publicized examples of impactful reparations initiatives targeting institutions specifically within the realm of higher education, including initiatives at Georgetown University, Princeton Theological Seminary, and Virginia Theological Seminary. Georgetown's movement toward reparations began in earnest in 2014, after a student newspaper published findings pertaining to Georgetown's previous ownership of hundreds of enslaved Africans who, through their labor and the sale of several hundred of these persons, generated significant portions of the college's operating revenues at the time. The publicizing of that history prompted the university's president to establish a working group in 2015 on slavery, memory, and reconciliation, which produced a report and recommendations. The recommendations included the establishment of a $100 million fund, half of which was to be used for racial reconciliation activities, a quarter in support of educational grants and scholarships for the descendants of the university's formerly enslaved persons, and the rest toward emergency health services for descendants, as well as for ancestry research. A foundation has been established by the university to administer this preparatory program. Reparations initiatives proceeded along similar lines at Princeton Theological Seminary and Virginia Theological, two of the wealthiest freestanding seminaries in the US. After conducting studies of their respective institutions' connections with slavery, and while not finding evidence in either instance that their institutions owned slaves, both seminaries launched programs in 2019 designed to disperse scholarships to descendants of enslaved Africans. Virginia Theological's preparatory program was endowed at $1.7 million, and by mid-2021, it provided modest scholarship payments to 15 descendants of Blacks who labored on its campus during slavery and during the segregation eras. While Princeton Theological allocated $27.8 million to endow a program costing $1 million per year that resources Black scholarships, Black campus programming, and Black faculty hiring. Although hailed by some as important marks of progress, others, even within these institutions, concluded these responses did not carry nearly far enough towards sought-after repairs. In the case of Princeton Theological, for example, several Black student leaders at the seminary calculated, quote, at least 15% of the seminary's $986 million endowment should be set aside for reparations, requiring from the seminary more than 5 times the amount it had approved. Black religious leaders also have been at the forefront of state and local reparations initiatives, including as part of a turn of the century campaign initiated in Tulsa, Oklahoma, for reparations in response to the 1921 massacre and mass destruction within its Black Wall Street neighborhood. A commission was formed in the late 1990s in Tulsa to document the 1921 atrocities and to recommend formal responses. And a Tulsa reparations coalition organized in 2001 committed to pursuing litigation that could achieve reparations in response to injustices visited upon Tulsa's Black population. Lawsuits are proceeding into the present, and the process has been actively supported by Black faith leaders, including high-profile weekly protests led by the current pastor of Mount Vernon AME Church in Tulsa, whose building singularly survived the fiery destruction of the Black Wall Street neighborhood. In 2019, Evanston, Illinois formally committed to reparations for slavery, with the city allocating $10 million over 10 years. 4% of that is to be applied toward housing assistance for Black residents, while decisions are still being made about the use to which the other 96% of the reparations monies will be put. Black faith leaders were a constituent part of the strong faith lobby that helped achieve Evanston's commitment to reparations. In 2020, the Asheville, North Carolina City Council approved the creation of a community reparations commission that will seek to respond to decades of racial discrimination in housing, education, health, economic development, and criminal justice. Nevertheless, despite the council's good intentions, pitfalls in its implementation became immediately evident as the Black Ministerial Alliance objected to being bypassed by the council in favor of a white downtown church and the facilitation of an initial affordable housing project emanating from the reparations proposal. These various examples illustrate that while an emphasis on achievable operational metrics and mechanics may result in more rapid and realizable reparations outcomes, the narrowing of frameworks and targets may not align well with key benchmarks within the reparations movement. With respect to maintaining integrity in the economic negotiations of reparations, for example, two leading reparations scholars who will be speaking here later in the series, William Garrity Jr. and A. Kirsten Mullen, set the white-black wealth differential at roughly $350,000 per person, and the amount of a reparations package for Black Americans at $14 trillion in total. Consequently, say Garrity and Mullen, state, local, or institutional sector reparations initiatives are piecemeal and work against national level approaches that alone possess the financial capacities required for a fair and just reparations metrics. Nevertheless, scaled approaches, these narrowing of targets and frameworks, have helped advance the reparations movement within the US. And while those approaches may have surrendered ground with respect to comprehensiveness of demands, they gained ground with respect to breadth of support for the movement. And just a final brief note here on Pittsburgh's Bethel AME as symbol of Black erasure and spur for reparatory justice. The Hill District's Bethel AME Church was Pittsburgh's largest African-American congregation by the mid-20th century, with a sanctuary seating 1,900 people and located on prime acreage adjacent to downtown Pittsburgh. In 1957, the church was taken as part of the city's seizure of the Lower Hill District land to make way for the construction of a new civic center where the Pittsburgh Penguins hockey team would play. Bethel was paid a meager $240,000 for its historic property. The Lower Black Hill community disappeared, and the Civic Center was constructed. In 2020, Bethel's current pastor, Dale Snyder, helped spearhead reparations demands in response to Bethel's losses, including calling for a return of title rights for its seized land and rights to develop vacant land adjacent to its former church property. Bethel's representatives have engaged in high-level conversations with the Pittsburgh Mayor's Office and Pittsburgh Penguins executives, where there has been receptivity to Bethel's demands. Bethel also has gained support for its cause within the wider faith community, including from national advocacy organizations such as Color of Change and INCOBRA, and from faith organizations within Pittsburgh and across the state. Support from faith groups has included local white congregations who formed a joint study group with Bethel on race and reparations and entered into a fundraising partnership with Bethel. The Pennsylvania Council of Churches also has rallied around reparations for Bethel, including organizing a workshop on the issues and formalizing a resolution calling for, quote, churches, organizations, and judicatory leaders to support reparations for Bethel from the city of Pittsburgh and the Pittsburgh Penguins, close quote. Bethel's demands have drawn heightened attention to a broader public discussion within Pittsburgh around reparation for Black Pittsburghers, dating back at least 2018, when Pittsburgh's new African Independence Party presented a reparations petition to the Pittsburgh City Council, inclusive of a call for a public hearing on the matter. Among New African Independence Party's reparations demands were cash, land, free tuition, debt relief, and the release of political prisoners. At least one city councilor was receptive on the issue, Pittsburgh pastor and city council member Ricky Burgess, who stated, quote, I think the way to go forward is to support the investment in traditional African-American communities where the majority of African-Americans in Pittsburgh live. If we begin to rebuild and significantly invest into areas like Homewood, Larimer, Belts Hoover, the Hill District, North Side, if we begin to invest $1 billion or so of money into those communities for development, I think you can see transformation, close quote. Although Bethel's efforts appear promising with respect to gaining satisfaction for its congregation's specific reparations demands, it remains to be seen how this will turn out for them and what carryover effect these efforts have in further enlivening broader initiatives related to Black reparations within Pittsburgh. Success along both lines would clearly be welcome and may be within reach. And I'll stop here and entertain discussion.
Thank you very much. That's for that riveting talk. I'm just going to say, we appreciate all that you have shared with us. We have an audience that's on Zoom, and we have people here. I think the game plan is to let you come back to the podium and take questions from the audience, both the online audience and the in-person audience.
And you will feel Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Welcome your questions, comments. Please.
I think some of you last year, the German government agreed to pay reparations to the Herero and Nama people in Namibia, but the agreement that they signed with the Namibian government did not use the expressions reparations or reparative justice or compensation, because the German government feared that it would set a precedent that would open a can of worms. And that was one point that many Herero and Nama descendants of Herero and Nama people were critical of. The other point being that it was an agreement signed with the Namibian government and not the tribal leaders. I recently, thanks to Carla here, had occasion to interview Dr. James Johnson, who runs the Afro-American Institute here of Music. And one of the sort of concerns he flagged was, if reparative justice is framed as monetary reparations, what percentage of African-American ancestry would you have to demonstrate or give proof for in order for you to receive such reparations? So in my understanding, someone like a Barack Obama would obviously be disqualified because he's a Black American, like Ilhan Omar, whereas his wife can claim the legacy of slavery, and so perhaps she would be, well, maybe she's above the income bracket, but someone who, so because of the mixing, and so how does it work? If you could answer that. And thank you, I really enjoyed listening to you.
Thank you for the question. So, two parts to your question. Addressing the first part, there clearly has been historically a reluctance particularly by national governments, or bodies, institutional bodies with sort of big footprints and big vulnerabilities, right? To use language like apology, reparations, any language that might be actionable, right, in a legal sense, because it does admit to wrongdoing. It's an admission of wrongdoing and guilt, which then lays that entity open to legal redress or legal action against them, right? So the United States government has never formally used the word apology. It's never formally apologized on slavery, including Barack Obama. They have engaged in some gestures to recognize, to acknowledge the pain and suffering of African Americans due to former enslavement, but would not go as far as to say, this was wrong, we apologize, we're culpable, and we'll take responsibility of some sort. Hasn't gone that direction. Now, they have done that in other instances with the internment of Japanese during World War II, some reparations payments paid to Native American peoples, but for whatever the reason, not African Americans. And so part of that is this concern about setting themselves up for legal action, providing the basis by which they can in fact be sued. So yeah, there's that issue. The other issue that you raise in your question is about, well, okay, so even when reparations happen, or if they happen, how do they happen? Who becomes sort of the conduit? Who becomes what becomes the mechanism for operationalizing those reparations? Well, it's a difficult question, and it's been probably the most difficult question in the reparations movement and reparations conversation. And as you can see from the presentation, the way that has been parsed in many instances is to target some specific sectors, to target some specific programmatic frameworks where the recipients, the beneficiaries are defined in some very specific terms. People who can trace their ancestry to formerly enslaved African Americans, or in the case of a couple of those higher education institutions, people can trace their ancestry to African Americans who were employed during segregation era by those institutions. But you can do that when there are sort of narrow or limits on what the reparations targets are. So with Princeton Theological, Virginia Theological, they're saying, well, the target is that we're going to set up some scholarship funds for those descendants, or scholarship assistance for those descendants, or we're going to, in the case of Princeton Theological, spend a whole bunch of millions of dollars on reconciliation programs inside the institution, and also scholarship assistance for African Americans generally within the institution, or helping with ancestry research. So very specific kind of ways that reparations are being conceived in terms of their operationalization. The narrower the framing, the definition, the more achievable perhaps. But as I try to suggest in the presentation, the pushback on that is, well, if you narrow it, you narrow for achievability, but do you narrow so much that you really lose the scope of the injury that needs to be accounted for, and the scope of how it is accounted for, and that clearly is part of the problem.
I'm going to keep the microphone so our Zoom.
Okay.
I guess I want to know where we're at now and what do we need to be doing. I know that my cousin, late Dr. Ellen, was hired way back to develop a formula reparations and develop a formula for correcting because of the undercount of African Americans. That it was really happening. And saying how many people would be given reparations because of the traditional piece where African Americans were not responding to the census. She did a formula, she was a sociologist, she did a formula for accounting for the undercount. Now, then there was a situation before Cornell West did his piece, where there needed to be a public outcry for reparations. Now, Farrakhan did that with the May Man March, but do we need to do another public mass outcome among African Americans for us to begin to move reparations and people again? So I have those two questions. And then what is the agenda now with churches and as well as in the reparations movement one of the main points that need to be addressed.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. So that is the perplexing issue. I mean, so how do you scale? How do you scale a response in ways that maximize what you can achieve, but allow you to achieve something? That's really the problem. And what are the steps that help get you to that goal, right? So certainly with any, as with any public policy advocacy, with any social movements, any kind of social advocacy, there are various dimensions to that advocacy. You know, there's that external pressure that comes from the masses of people. There are people working inside institutions that are in a position to make decisions and leverage power and resources. You know, there are scholars who raise the issues and help to frame the issues. I mean, there are always multiple steps in any social movement, in any social action. And the same is obviously true with the reparations movement. There has been pressure from the streets, like a million, not so much the Million Man March, but the Millions for Reparations protest in 2002, where hundreds of thousands of people gathered on the mall, specifically around the reparations agenda. That is an important mobilization. It has visibility. Question is, who's paying attention to that? Who's paying attention to any such actions, mobilizations on the streets? I mean, are those mobilizations being done strategically enough to ensure that the message is getting to the people in the position to make some decisions? If not, then it's important, but it's more expressive than it is instrumental, right? It's not achieving an instrumental objective or aim. So the civil rights movement was very clear on that distinction. And those leaders within the civil rights struggle were taken to the streets, but they were doing it with very clear understandings of how that action on the streets could and would impact the people sitting in the positions to make decisions, including the '63 March on Washington, which some have criticized as being a little bit too closely aligned with John Kennedy and leaders in Congress, right? But that was about ensuring the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill, right? I mean, so it clearly was about that. The '65 March in Selma was about passing the voting rights bill. So there was a close connectivity and alignment between the action on the streets and an achievable outcome. And I'm suggesting that I think the reparations movement is definitely moving more in that direction, moving away from expressive action that is not able to take on instrumental dimensions, but still trying to keep all those things connected. So yeah, I mean, where it is now, there are lots of different pockets of mobilization taking place around the country on reparations. I think the HR 40 bill is an overarching kind of motivation to some extent. I mean, it's very high profile. It's happening in Congress. That agenda has been proceeding for decades. It's close to passage, at least in the House. So I mean, I think the HR 40 bill has provided a helpful organizing occasion, right? it's helped. I think it's breathed some life. It's been some wind under the wings of local municipal legislative agendas around reparations, like in Evanston or Asheville, Tulsa. But it's also been that visible signal of a greater acceptability of the reparations discussion within American public life that has allowed lots of other local reparations mobilizations to feel encouraged and to press for their more specific objectives. So I think, you know, it's really an ecology. It's an ecology that's operative in this instance and in any social movements instance. It's a broad ecology of powerful institutions and strategically placed leaders and scholars, community activists on the ground, rank and file soldiers, the foot soldiers, boots on the ground. It's just a lot of people involved in any successful mobilization. And I think we're seeing a lot of those pieces coming together with greater intentionality, clarity, and purposefulness within the reparations movement.
I do have a question from the chat. Thank you for the engaging and informative history of the relationship between the Black church and work for reparations. What is your sense of the best path forward on reparations, and how would you encourage churches, Black, white, and other traditions to be engaged at this moment?
Well, thanks for the question. Again, I think I partly answered that with what I just said about this broad ecology in which there are lots of moving parts, including the faith sector. The faith sector, strategic, resourceful, and increasingly, at least cadres of faith leaders who have been rallying around the reparations cause. Their involvements have tended to be increasingly tied to more specific proposals, whether they're local or whether they're sector specific. I would just say to any faith leader, any faith institution or organization, to simply look for places to enter into that movement, whether that means starting at the local level with mobilizations taking place locally. In Pittsburgh, Bethel AME's demands have helped to galvanize pre-existing demands on the ground for Black reparations that go back before Bethel's initiative. Reparations demands, these recent reparations demands by Bethel. There's a local kind of mobilization taking place. It has some specified contours. There are negotiations and conversations taking place about how to find that sweet spot. It can't just be about Bethel, and it can't just be about, on the other end of the spectrum, accounting for centuries of Black oppression without specifying how that gets done, right? So I mean, you've got two sort of polarities on that. So where's the sweet spot locally in Pittsburgh? Who are the players locally that you come alongside? The New African Independence Party, the city council, the mayor's office, Pennsylvania Council of Churches. Who are the players locally? And then denominations and congregations have been very, several denominations, several ecumenical organizations have been quite mobilized around HR 40. That's a place, that's an entry point. So your denomination, that might be an entry point for your denomination. If your denomination has not been part of that advocacy work, I named the ones that were the UCC, the United Methodist Church, the Episcopal Church. That's a lot of denominations left that can join the cause, right? Obviously, there's a whole process for how that takes place internal to denominations or ecumenical organizations, how they come up with resolutions, how they come up with organizational commitments to take on a particular cause. So work those processes, look for the openings, and enter where it's strategic and available to enter. Dr. Trotter.
Yeah, I am wondering, what is your perspective on labor unions and these conversations that are unfolding about reparations, locally, nationally, and what kind of role do you imagine that organized labor unions can play? We know that they are weak, much weaker now than they've been, during the mid-20th century. But is there something of a role that they may be playing now in organizations that you may know about? And I know faith-based organizations have people who are members of churches, they are members of unions, they are members of a lot of other things. I wondered about that dimension.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dr. Trotter. Well, from a conceptual standpoint, that is, with respect to the conceptual capital around reparations, I can think of no better sectors positioned on that than potentially, theoretically, the faith sector and the labor union sector. I mean, the faith sector making the sort of moral and theological argument about how one responds ethically to social injury, especially social injury of the magnitude of what we're talking about with the enslavement of many people for many years and all that issued from that injury, that initial injury, right? So the faith sector making the moral argument about what is required of us as human beings and as nations and as institutions, right? But the labor unions making the argument about how we value labor, how we value the work that our people render, and how that was not valued for hundreds of years for so many people, African Americans who were enslaved and working for no wages and under horrific conditions, right? Atrocities abounding at every turn. Labor unions are all about working conditions, worker rights, how we value, the valuations that we place on labor, right? So labor unions are strategically positioned from a conceptual standpoint to bring a powerful case on reparations. They're also strategically positioned from a human capital standpoint. I mean, yeah, labor unions have been hit hard, but there's still a lot of people in labor unions. And there's organizational infrastructure. And they have traditions of standing up for rights. Protest is part of the DNA of a labor union. So from a methodological standpoint, I mean, this is not a reach. This is what they do, right? So conceptually and operationally, it seems to me, labor unions are very strategically positioned. They have been involved to some extent in the reparations movement. There's so much more room for them to take an even greater role. And I think with potentially great effect.
I have another question here. Thank you for the talk. When discussing faith leaders, should we look at them as individuals who are leaders and of some faith, or as representatives of some connected body? Basically, should we take leaders as speaking from themselves or on behalf of?
Thanks for that question. Well, I think every leader has to answer that question for his or herself. obviously, those are determinations that are made within that context, that individual leadership context. So you don't want to be a pastor who gets out in the community and says that he or she is speaking for the congregation on some issue that the congregation is not in fact empowered them to speak on, right? That obviously does not have like good long-term effect, but or a leader of an organization or of a denomination or an ecumenical group or whatever that gets out ahead of the constituency that empowers that person to speak and in the ways that person is empowered to speak, right? So every individual leader, faith leader or otherwise, has to make a determination about the extent of their capacity to speak on behalf of the institution that they're part of. You know, how is that written into their job description, written into the institutional constitution, the bylaws, the organizational structure, and so forth. So when I talk about the denominations that have come alongside the reparations cause, that went through an internal process with those denominations. Those denominations voted to take the actions that they took. Pennsylvania Council of Churches voted to take the action that it took on behalf of the resolution on reparations. So I mean, so there's an internal process. Now, clearly, we always have leaders who have made a determination that they are joining the cause, but speaking as an individual, not on behalf of an institution. They can't say necessarily, well, I speak for my institution on this. They can say, I speak for myself on this. And so I think you can have leaders that operate on both levels. But clearly the need is for the broadest possible networks around any mobilization. And so that's one of the key reasons for trying to find that place within the dialogue where you can define the solution in the most possible comprehensive terms, in terms of what you get, what the outcome will be, but not so much so that you can't bring people along. You know, a leader without a following is just out for a stroll. So you can lead, you can sound good on the issue. You can hit all the right chords, right? You can come down straight down the line on every issue that theoretically deserves to be addressed. But if you can't bring anybody along, then you don't really have a move.
Is there another in the chat? Okay.
I think we have one, maybe one last.
I don't know, I'm speaking loud, but I first of all, thank you for your lecture, very enlightening. I just like, kind of like historically, we have interfaith relationships. So we have in the 60s, Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, they're on the same agenda. And so now, as we move forward in your lecture, it becomes more like separate, it seems. Like you have Farrakhan over here, you might have Christian organizations there, but just thinking about interfaith connections, intra-faith connections, for example, like you said, there's lots of denominations in churches, for example. Are they unified? How can they become unified? They're becoming dialogue with each other. How can other communities of faith, for example, the Muslims or whoever, because the Black community is so dynamic, so faithfully dynamic to the point where the more we become like a nationalist group of people, we start forgetting that we are not one type of people. We are very dynamic and we have lots of conversations. So I guess my question is thinking about the intersection of class, denomination, and power. Because we know transnationally, what has happened is that governments have come in giving a certain type of religion funding. They gain power, and then other tribal religions and other types of religions are like more of a different class. So just thinking about Pittsburgh, what kind of intra-faith conversation or dialogue is going on as far as reparations, and is there a class, denomination, and power dynamic locally?
Well, to your last question, I think there's always going to be a class issue that troubles the waters of our movement activities. I mean, that's just been the case. And the voices that most often are heard are the empowered voices. The ones that don't get heard, and the ones that probably most need to be heard in these issues related to social injury, social injustice, are rank and file poor folks. And so they're not at those tables, and their voices often are not heard, and they're not even empowered in a lot of the mobilizations that may be taking place on the streets. So no, there's always going to be that class issue that has to be acknowledged and addressed. Now, with respect to the interfaith aspect, there was a lot of cooperation and intersection between Minister Farrakhan and Black clergy, even around that Millions for Reparations march and protest. I mean, Herb Daltrey is a Pentecostal pastor. And he and Minister Farrakhan worked closely together in that particular event, and more beyond that event as well. So I mean, yeah, there's big cooperation, but so to zoom out a little from that, again, the issue is, are the issues being framed in any particular instance in a way that allows or that permits the broadest possible alliances to take place around that issue? Well, I mean, the way that historically some of the framing of the reparations cause took place from Bishop Henry McNeil Turner in the late 1800s, all the way up to, say, Minister Farrakhan. The immigrationist aspect, for example, back to Africa, gets the land, Black folks need to just go start their own thing. You know, the self-determination piece, the self-sufficiency piece. Well, yeah, that was part of the reparations framing for that generation of leadership, those generations of leadership, faith leaders that had interfaith. I mean, the Black religious nationalists were very much on board with Bishop Henry McNeil Turner, an A&E bishop, around some of that. I mean, the interfaith was there. The framing, though, was such that it may not have lent itself to the kind of broader mobilizations and coalitions that we're seeing in the so-called modern day reparations movement, right? So yes, some things are going to get, some things are not necessarily going to advance to the next step because the framing of it may not be conducive to achievability. And I just think that's where things are at this point with the reparations. And with most things, it's not enough to be a prophet. What can you achieve? I mean, that's, I think, the way a lot of the thinking is. Not that we don't have a need for prophets, because we can become so utilitarian that we lose our vision. So it's an ecology. And I think reparations movement, just sort of a last statement here, I think there's been some good movement. I think the faith sector is finding ways to effectively be involved with that and to take some important leadership along the way. And I think there's potential for some very concrete achievements in that movement in the immediate years to come.
I think there may be one.
There is one more question, and we'll probably have to make it our last question. When you prefaced, at least as far back as 1897, active reparation discussion within the African American as well as the international organizations of concern, our existence in our communities have taken on a warlike existence with our own government. So wouldn't an immediate response to demand give immediate help? Ukraine did it, 35 billion, Israel, 9 billion per year forever. The solution is in the doing. Could you elaborate?
Well, certainly, I mean, the issue is, and I think that the concern for the reparations movement, going back to some of those very earliest reparations conversations, the African-American clergymen in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was the mutual aid society, right? Soldiers, Union soldiers, were receiving subsidies and assistance. African Americans should receive subsidies and assistance as well. I mean, there's always been a comparison of what some receive, even as African Americans with similar claims have not been able to receive. I mean, so that's always been the issue. The US government has given reparations in certain instances, but not to African Americans making claims on reparations. International governments or governments across the globe have engaged in reparations behaviors toward certain groups, certain nations, certain peoples, but not necessarily toward Africa, former colonies, or toward African Americans. So yeah, that imbalance, that inequity is certainly one that has to be addressed. But clearly there's opposition to doing that. That's why we've been at the same place for so long. So how do we act strategically? And I think that's what many in the reparations movement are saying implicitly or explicitly. How do we take steps that get the ball further down the field? We can make the pure claim. You know, we can make the case to the fullest extent that the case needs to be made, but maybe get nowhere with it except that we've expressed it. You got to bring people along, and as people in the reparations movement dating back to the 1800s have known, this is not a receptive environment to African American reparations claims. It was in the late 1800s. It's still not today. It's better today than it was then. But we can't pretend that all we need to do is just say that this is something that must happen. And then therefore it happens just because we say it. We have to figure out how to strategically advance the ball.
So, that's amazing. Thank you. Let us hold on just a minute. Let us give Professor Drew Smith another.
I want to say a couple of things before you break, before you leave. This has been the lecture that we in the Democratic Future Project needed. You did exactly what we want. This is because over the remaining part of this semester and all next semester, we're going to have talks following up on this particular dimension of what we're dealing with. So you'll set a great context for us to go forward.
Go ahead.
And next week, in fact, on Thursday, this is within the Democratic Futures Project, we're going to convene via Zoom to really build on what you have just shared with us. So thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Butler.
Okay. And thank you everybody for coming. Okay.